Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the one who would become known as the BTK Killer. Close your eyes and let your mind travel back to the mid-70s, to a place where the wind sweeps across the vast, rolling plains of Kansas, carrying with it the scent of cold earth and distant wood smoke. It is 1974 in Wichita. The air in the middle of January is a sharp, biting cold that clings to the skin and turns every breath into a fleeting, ghostly mist that vanishes as quickly as it appears. Wichita, known then as the air capital of the world, was a place defined by steady industry and quiet, unassuming neighborhoods. The city was a patchwork of modest homes, wide streets, and the constant, distant hum of the aviation plants that fueled its economy and gave its people a sense of purpose. On this particular morning, Tuesday, January 15th, the sky is a flat, pale gray, a heavy blanket of cloud that seems to press down on the frost-covered rooftops. Imagine the sound of tires crunching over a thin, brittle layer of ice on the pavement, the rhythmic scraping of metal shovels against concrete driveways, and the low, mournful whistle of the wind through the leafless branches of the old oak trees. It was a day like any other, a morning filled with the mundane, comforting rituals of a Midwestern winter. Heavy wool coats, steaming mugs of coffee, and the shared, silent understanding that the cold was simply a guest to be endured until the eventual spring thaw. At 803 North Edgemore Street, the Otero household was stirring with the quiet life of a large, busy family. Joseph Otero, a 38-year-old retired Air Force sergeant, and his wife, Julie, who was 33, were the pillars of this home. They were people of deep discipline and profound warmth, raising their children with a sense of order, respect, and love. Imagine the interior of their home as the sun tries to peek through the gray, the smell of frying bacon and toasted bread wafting through the narrow hallways, the soft, rhythmic ticking of a wooden wall clock in the kitchen, and the muffled, happy sounds of children preparing for their school day. 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josephine were part of this morning symphony, their voices light and energetic against the backdrop of the winter chill pressing against the glass. The house was filled with the soft textures of the early 70s, heavy drapes meant to keep out the drafts, thick shag carpeting that cushioned every step, and the familiar, comforting clutter of a life well lived. To any neighbor walking by, the Otero home was a bastion of safety, a place where the doors were often left unlocked, and the community felt like one large, extended family. But on this morning, the domestic peace was about to be shattered by a presence that did not belong, a shadow that had been watching from the periphery for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to step inside. The intruder did not arrive with a crash or a shout. He came with a chilling, calculated silence that was more terrifying than any noise. Dennis Rader, a 28-year-old man who lived just a short drive away in Park City, had been stalking the family, studying their movements and their routines with a cold, detached precision. He moved toward the back of the house, his gloved hands steady and sure as he reached for the telephone line. With a sudden, sharp snap, he severed the wire, a small act that instantly isolated the family from the world beyond their walls, cutting off their only lifeline. Imagine the silence that followed that snap, a sound lost to the whistling wind. When he entered the house, he brought the freezing January air with him, a sudden, sharp drop in temperature that the family might have barely noticed at first in their morning rush. He used a firearm to gain control, his voice calm and steady as he told a series of lies, claiming he was a desperate man in need of money and a car. The psychological weight of that moment is heavy, the transition from a normal, mundane morning to a state of absolute, paralyzed fear. He began to bind them, using cords cut from the very Venetian blinds that covered their windows and rope, meant for a backyard clothesline. The mundane objects of their daily life were transformed into instruments of terror. He moved with a slow, methodical pace, relishing the absolute control he held over the family. A dark, long-simmering fantasy finally manifesting into a horrific reality within the walls of a home that should have been their sanctuary. As the afternoon arrived, the light began to change, the sun dipping lower toward the horizon as the school day finally ended. At approximately 3:30, the three oldest Otero children, 15-year-old Charlie, 13-year-old Carmen, and their brother Danny, began their familiar walk home from school. Imagine the sound of their light-hearted chatter, the way their breath curled in the frozen air as they laughed and discussed the trivialities of their day. As they turned onto Edgemore Street, everything looked exactly the same, yet a subtle, inexplicable wrongness hung in the air, a tension that only the heart can sense. When Charlie reached the house, he noticed their dog, Lucky, standing alone in the backyard, an unusual sight for a dog that was never left out in such biting cold. The back door was unlocked, swaying slightly. As he stepped inside, the house greeted him not with the warmth of his mother's voice or the smell of an afternoon snack, but with a silence so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. The air was unnervingly still. In the kitchen, he saw his mother's purse sitting on the stove. Its contents spilled out in a chaotic mess that suggested a sudden, violent interruption to a peaceful routine. He called out for his parents, his voice small and fragile as it echoed through the empty rooms, but only the heavy, oppressive quiet of the winter afternoon answered him. The discovery was a nightmare that would never truly end for the surviving children. Charlie moved through the house, eventually finding his parents in the master bedroom, bound and lifeless. His father, Joseph, lay on the floor, while his mother, Julie, was on the bed. The sight was unfathomable, a brutal violation of everything he knew to be true and safe in the world. In another room, he found 9-year-old Joey. And later, the authorities would discover 11-year-old Josephine in the basement, where the intruder had performed what he would later call his encore. The sheer cruelty of the scene was a shock to the collective senses of the city. The physical evidence of a struggle, the clinical way the ligatures had been applied, and the absolute, echoing void left behind by the loss of 4 members of a single family. As the police sirens began to wail through the quiet, suburban neighborhood, the news spread like a cold front across Wichita. The initial terror was profound and immediate. This was not a crime of passion or a simple robbery gone wrong. It was something far more sinister, a calculated evil that the community had never encountered. The city of Wichita, once a place of open doors and trusting hearts, began to pull inward, recoiling from the unknown. The shadows of Edgemore Street seemed to stretch out to touch every porch and every park, marking the beginning of a decades-long reign of fear. The one who would soon call himself BTK had claimed his first victims, and the peaceful sleep of the plains was gone, replaced by a vigilance that would last for 30 years. The silence in the wake of the first tragedy was heavy, a thick blanket of uncertainty that settled over the city of Wichita. Months turned into a slow, grinding crawl through the seasons. It was October of 1974 when the quiet was finally punctured, not by a scream, but by a phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, a nondescript man speaking to Don Granger at the Wichita Eagle and Beacon. He spoke of a letter, a secret waiting in the shadows of the Wichita Public Library. Imagine the library in mid-autumn, the smell of floor wax and old, yellowing paper hanging in the cool air. Somewhere among the thousands of volumes, tucked inside a heavy mechanical engineering textbook, lay a message that would change the city forever. When the police finally retrieved the envelope, they found pages filled with erratic typing and jagged misspellings. It was a confession, a cold accounting of the lives taken in January, but it was also a manifesto. The writer spoke of a monster that had entered his brain, a pressure he could not control. He described his crimes as a big, complicated game, a cycle of stalking and waiting in the dark. And then At the very end, he gave himself a name. He told the world that he would be known by 3 initials, a cold acronym for his method. Bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK, the letters felt sharp, like a blade hidden between the lines of a nursery rhyme. For 3 long years, the monster seemed to retreat into the tall grass of the Kansas prairies. The city tried to heal, but the memory of those letters lingered like a bitter taste. People locked their doors more firmly, their eyes darting toward the shadows whenever the sun dipped below the horizon. Then came March 17, 1977. It was St. Patrick's Day, a day usually filled with the bright green of celebration and the promise of early spring. But the air was gray and biting. Shirley Vian, a 26-year-old mother, was at home with her 3 young children when a stranger appeared. He didn't look like a monster. He wore a tweed jacket and slacks, carrying a briefcase like any other working man in the neighborhood. He used a cruel trick to gain entry, showing a photograph of his own children to Shirley's young son, pretending to be a detective looking for information. Once the door clicked shut behind him, the mask fell away. He produced a gun and forced Shirley and her children into the house. The horror of that afternoon was magnified by the presence of the innocents. He locked the 3 children, aged 4, 6, and 8, inside the bathroom, telling them to stay quiet or they would never see their mother again. Through the thin wood of the door, they could hear the soft, terrifying sounds of a struggle they couldn't understand. He used a plastic bag and a length of rope, working with a clinical, detached cruelty, while the children sat on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, waiting for a mother who would never open the door. The killer's hunger for attention was growing, a dark fire fed by the fear he sowed. By the time December of 1977 arrived, he had already selected his next target, a 25-year-old woman named Nancy Fox. He called her Project Fox Hunt, a cold and dehumanizing title for a living, breathing person. He watched her. He learned the rhythm of her life, the time she arrived home from work at the jewelry store, the way the light looked in her windows at night. On the night of December 8, the temperature had dropped, and a winter chill was settling deep into the bones of the city. He cut the phone lines, a silent severing of her connection to the outside world, and waited in the darkness of her kitchen. When Nancy returned, she was met with a nightmare. In a bizarre and chilling moment of twisted intimacy, he allowed her to smoke a final cigarette. Think of the orange glow of the cherry in the dark room, the smoke curling toward the ceiling, the seconds ticking away as she realized there was no escape. He was meticulous, using a belt and pantyhose to bind her, his movements practiced and rhythmic. He took his time, savoring the control, the life fading out under the weight of his hands. To him, it was a performance, a ritual that ended with the silence of the room and the theft of her driver's license, a trophy to be kept in his private collection of shadows. The next morning, the sun rose over a city that was about to receive another shock. At a payphone on the corner of Central and Hillside, the killer deposited a coin and dialed the police dispatcher. His voice was steady, almost polite, but with a strange, clipped cadence. He told the operator that they would find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. He pronounced the word as homicide, lingering on the first syllable with a haunting, Midwestern drawl. He wanted to be the one to report his work, to ensure that the spectacle was discovered exactly as he had arranged it. He wasn't just a murderer anymore. He was a narrator, directing the police through the scenes of his own creation. The tape of that call would later be played for the public, a ghostly recording of a man who could be anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, a husband. The city listened to that voice, searching for a hint of familiarity, but found only a void. BTK was no longer just a name in a letter. He was a phantom who walked the streets of Wichita, a man who could kill and then calmly go home to his own family, his hands clean of the blood but his mind already planning the next chapter of his dark book. As 1978 began, the correspondence became even more theatrical. In late January, a male clerk at the Wichita Eagle opened an envelope containing an index card. On it was a poem, a parody of a nursery rhyme titled Shirley Locks, a cruel ode to Shirley Vian. He used rubber stamps to press the letters into the paper, a childish method for a deadly message. A few weeks later, another letter arrived at KAKETV, thicker this time, filled with drawings and a poem titled Oh, Death to Nancy. He complained that he wasn't getting enough national attention, asking how many people he had to kill to become famous. He was mocking the investigators, taunting the very people who were sworn to protect the city. The atmosphere in Wichita turned from fear to a suffocating paranoia. Every creak of a floorboard, every rattling window, every stranger on the sidewalk became a potential encounter with the monster. The letters were his way of staying present, of ensuring that even when he wasn't killing, he was still occupying the thoughts of every citizen. He was a shadow that refused to fade, a writer who used the city as his parchment and the lives of its people as his ink. The correspondence from the dark had only just begun, and the weight of his words would haunt the plains of Kansas for decades to come. As the final embers of the 1970s flickered out, a strange and heavy silence settled over the city of Wichita. The theatrical letters, the frantic phone calls, and the terrifying proximity of the killer seemed to dissolve into the humid Kansas air. For the investigators who had spent years chasing a shadow, the sudden absence of the monster felt less like a victory and more like a breath held too long in the dark. The folders in the police archives grew thick with dust, the edges of the photographs curling in the stale office air. The world was moving forward into a decade of neon and rapid change, but the phantom who called himself BTK remained, woven into the very fabric of the suburbs. He was no longer a headline, he was a neighbor. He was the man you passed at the grocery store, the man who meticulously polished his car on Saturday mornings, the man who seemed to disappear into the mundane rhythm of a quiet, working-class life. The fear that had gripped the community began to scab over, replaced by the collective hope that the nightmare had simply moved on, or perhaps had finally ceased to breathe. By the middle of the 1980s, the man behind the mask, Dennis Rader, had perfected his performance of normalcy. At his job with a DT Security Services, he was known as a man of ironclad habits. His coworkers whispered about his rigid nature, giving him the nickname Blue Book Man because he lived and breathed the company's manual of regulations. He would stand in the sterile, fluorescent light of the office, his fingers tracing the fine print of a policy, scolding anyone who dared to engage in idle chatter during the workday. There was a cold, mechanical precision to his movements as he installed security alarms in the homes of the very people who feared him most. He was the one who checked the locks, the one who tested the sensors, and the one who knew exactly how to bypass the very barriers he was paid to build. In his private moments, the shadows of his mind were still churning. On a crisp April evening in 1985, the silence was finally broken. His neighbor, a 53-year-old woman named Maureen Hedge, lived only a few doors down. The proximity was a thrill to him. He watched her through the thin slats of his blinds, noting the patterns of her life until the night he stepped out of the darkness and into her home. He took her to the Christ Lutheran Church, the very place where he served as a leader. In the hollow, hallowed silence of the sanctuary, beneath the vaulted ceilings and the watchful eyes of the icons, he posed her body and captured her image in the flicker of his camera flash, a desecration hidden behind the heavy wooden doors of faith. The year 1986 brought the heat of a Kansas summer that lingered into September. Vicki Wedrell was a 28-year-old mother, her life centered around the soft sounds of her children playing and the daily routines of a cozy home. On a Tuesday morning, a man appeared at her door, dressed in the unassuming clothes of a telephone repairman. It was a ruse as old as time, a simple lie that granted him entry past the threshold. Inside, the air was still, the sunlight filtering through the curtains in long, golden shafts. The violence was swift and clinical, leaving behind a scene that would haunt her husband, Bill, for the next 18 years. Because the killer had gone so quiet, because the trail had grown so cold, the investigators looked not toward a phantom, but toward the man left behind. Bill Wedgerl lived under a cloud of suspicion that darkened every room he entered, while the true predator returned to his own family, sitting down to dinner, helping his children with their schoolwork, and participating in the polite conversations of a suburban evening. The double life was no longer a strain. It was a masterpiece of compartmentalization. He had become a ghost who could walk through walls of social expectation, his true nature buried so deep beneath the surface of his blue-collar uniform that even those who slept under his roof could not see the cracks in his soul. As the decade turned and the 1990s began, the predator made a career change that mirrored his inner compulsions. In May of 1991, he became a compliance officer for Park City. It was a role that granted him a badge and the authority to police the smallest details of his neighbors' lives. He was the man who would walk onto a lawn with a wooden ruler, measuring the height of the grass to ensure it did not exceed the city ordinance by a fraction of an inch. He was the man who chased stray dogs with a tranquilizer gun, his face set in a mask of stern, uncompromising duty. To the residents, he was a nuisance, a stickler for rules who seemed to take a dark pleasure in the exercise of his minor power. They did not know that this same man had recently slipped away from a Cub Scout camping trip in the dead of winter. In January of 1991, he had targeted Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman who lived alone. He abducted her from her home, the cold wind howling across the flat plains as he drove her toward a bridge over a secluded river. There, in the bitter chill of the Kansas night, he ended her life and left her beneath the concrete arches. He then returned to the warmth of the Scouts' campfire, his hands steady as he helped the boys roast marshmallows, the smell of wood smoke masking the scent of the night's work. It was his final murder of the century, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a long, bloody sentence. The years that followed were the true dormant years, a long stretch of time where the monster seemed to have finally fallen into a deep and permanent sleep. Throughout the remainder of the 1990s, the city of Wichita breathed easier. The task force had been disbanded, the leads had dried up, and the name BTK had become a piece of local folklore, a campfire story used to warn children to lock their doors. Dennis Rader was now the president of his church council, a respected figure who managed the congregation's finances and oversaw the maintenance of the building. He walked the halls of the church with a ring of keys jingling at his hip, the master of every lock. He was a father who saw his children grow, a husband who celebrated anniversaries, and a civil servant who was known for his punctuality and his obsession with order. To look at him was to see the very picture of Midwestern stability. But in the dark corners of his basement, in the hidden folders and the secret boxes tucked behind boxes of Christmas decorations, he kept his trophies. He had driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, and thousands of pages of his own writing, a private museum of his depravity. He was waiting. He was watching the news, watching the way technology was changing the world, and feeling the itch of his own ego. The silence was not peace. It was merely a long, slow inhalation. The city believed the nightmare was over, but the man with the ruler and the badge was simply biding his time, waiting for the moment when the world would forget him just enough for him to want to be remembered once again. Wichita had grown comfortable in its silence. For more than a decade, the phantom that had haunted its dreams since the early 1970s seemed to have dissolved into the humid summer air and the biting winter winds. The collective memory of the city was beginning to soften at the edges, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. The children who had once been ushered inside before sunset were now parents themselves, checking the locks on their own doors out of habit rather than immediate terror. the name that had once curdled blood, the three initials that stood for binding, torturing, and killing, was becoming a footnote in the history of the Great Plains, a campfire story used to warn of a darkness that had surely passed. But as the winter of 2003 gave way to the frozen dawn of 2004, a quiet restlessness was stirring in a small, unremarkable house in Park City. Inside, a man who had spent his life blending into the beige background of suburbia was looking at the calendar with a strange, clinical focus. It had been exactly 30 years since the Otero family had been taken from the world on a cold January morning in 1974. The anniversary was a milestone that the city could not ignore, and neither could the man who had caused it. He felt the weight of those 30 years not as a burden of guilt, but as a legacy that was being unfairly forgotten. On the 11th of January, 2004, the Wichita Eagle published a commemorative piece. It was a Sunday morning when the light was pale and the air was brittle with frost. The newspaper carried a long retrospective, a deep dive into the 3 decades of mystery that remained unsolved. The ink on the pages was fresh, that distinct, sharp scent of newsprint wafting up as people opened the paper at their breakfast tables. The reporter, Hearst Laviana, meticulously laid out the facts of the cold case, noting how the investigation had reached a standstill. He suggested that the killer had likely died, or moved far away, or perhaps was sitting in a prison cell for some other sin. Dennis Rader sat at his kitchen table, the paper spread out before him in the quiet light. He felt the coarse texture of the newsprint under his fingertips. He was a man of rigid routines, a compliance officer, a leader in his church, a father, but the sight of his own history being discussed as a relic of the past ignited something dormant and dangerous within him. He was, as he would later admit to investigators, simply bored. The children were grown and gone. His daily life was a cycle of mundane rules, and the world seemed to have forgotten the power he once held over the heartbeat of the city. He didn't want the story to end with a quiet fading out. He wanted to correct the record and show the world that the monster was still very much alive. The long silence finally broke on a Friday morning, the 19th of March, 2004. In the newsroom of the Wichita Eagle, the air was thick with the usual hum of business, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic clacking of keys, and the faint, constant vibration of the building. Hearst Laviana was preparing for his daily police briefing when his editor handed him a plain, white envelope that had just arrived in the mailroom. It looked ordinary, but the return address featured a name that stopped the breath in Laviana's throat: Bill Thomas Kilman. The initials B, T, and K leaped off the paper with a terrifying clarity. Inside was a single photocopy, a sheet of paper that would shatter the peace of the city for good. It contained 3 grainy images of a woman and a copy of a driver's license belonging to Vicki Wedrell, who had been killed in 1986. For 18 years, her death had been a source of agonizing suspicion for her husband, Bill, who had lived under a heavy cloud of doubt and whispers. But as Laviana looked at the photographs, he realized with a sickening jolt that these were not police crime scene photos. They were taken from angles only the killer could have reached. They were posed and intimate, captured by a person who had stood in that room and watched the light leave her eyes. The ghost was no longer a memory, he was a correspondent. The newsroom went quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and cold as the realization set in. The letter was postmarked March 17th, the 27th anniversary of the murder of Shirley Vian. This was not a random act of a copycat. It was a carefully choreographed performance by a man who treated his crimes like a dark art project. The police department was thrown into a state of high alert, a special task force forming within hours. Detectives, some of whom were still in elementary school when the first murders occurred, gathered around the evidence. They looked at the photocopy, the way the ink was uneven, the way the images seemed to stare back at them with a taunting defiance. The realization hit the community like a physical blow. The killer was not a ghost. He was a neighbor. He was someone who had walked the same streets for 30 years, watching the city grow and change while he kept his secrets locked away in the shadows of a normal life. The fear that had defined the 70s returned with a modern edge. People began to check the batteries in their flashlights and the strength of their deadbolts. The Phantom of Wichita had walked back into the light, and he was ready to play a new game of cat and mouse, one that he believed he could never lose. As the spring of 2004 deepened, the communications began to arrive with a chilling frequency. The killer seemed to revel in the renewed attention, delighting in the way the local news stations lead every broadcast with his initials. He began to leave packages in public places, turning the city's parks into drop zones for his macabre trophies. In May, a local television station received a word search puzzle and more photocopies of identification cards. In June, a man found a white plastic bag in Murdoch Park, wrapped tightly with thick rubber bands. Inside, nestled among the dry leaves and the dirt, was the driver's license of Nancy Fox, a woman who had been taken in 1977. The leather of the wallet was aged, and the laminate on the card had yellowed over the decades, but it served as a physical bridge to a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly present. The killer was writing his own biography in real time, sending lists of chapters and puzzles that he expected the police to solve. He was a man who craved a stage, and for the first time in 30 years, the entire country was his audience. He felt invincible, hidden behind the mask of a devoted churchgoer and a strict code enforcement officer. He was a creature of the old world trying to navigate the new one, unaware that the very technology he sought to master would eventually become the mirror that reflected his true face back to the world. The 30-year echo was no longer a fading sound. It was a deafening roar that would not stop until the truth was finally dragged into the light. The winter air in Wichita during February of 2005 was a biting, persistent cold that seemed to seep through the very brickwork of the city. At the offices of the local television station, KSA-STV, the morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of a package that felt heavier than its physical weight. Inside a nondescript manila envelope lay a collection of items that felt like relics from a nightmare. There was a photocopy of a book cover for a novel titled Rules of Prey, a gold-colored necklace with a large, gleaming medallion, and most curiously, a small, purple plastic disc. This was a 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk, its vibrant violet casing standing out against the drab gray of the station's mailroom table. It was a digital message from a ghost, a killer who had haunted the Kansas plains for over 3 decades and was now reaching out across the electronic void. The staff handled the envelope with a cautious, trembling reverence, the paper crinkling with a sound like dry autumn leaves, while the metallic scent of the jewelry inside mingled with the faint, ozone smell of the station's broadcasting equipment. Before this disc had been mailed, a strange and quiet dialogue had played out in the classified sections of the Wichita Eagle newspaper. The killer, hiding behind the name Rex, had asked a question that revealed his aging vanity. He wanted to know if a floppy disk could be traced back to a specific computer, or if it was a safe vessel for his taunts. The investigators, led by Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, saw a narrow window of opportunity. They placed an advertisement in the paper, a simple, deceptive message that read, "Rex, it will be okay." It was a digital siren song, a lie whispered through the newsprint to lure a monster into the light. The killer, emboldened by this assurance, sat at a computer in the quiet of a community space, believing he was invisible. He did not understand that the technology of 2005 had far outpaced the methods of his youth. He viewed the disk as a simple container for text, unaware that every save and every edit left a ghost-like trail of data buried deep within the magnetic sectors of the plastic square. In the sterile, quiet sanctuary of the police department's forensic lab, Officer Randy Stone prepared to perform a digital autopsy. The room was filled with the low, steady hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. He slid the purple disc into the drive, a sharp mechanical sound that echoed in the small room. A small green light began to flicker, a steady heartbeat of data transfer. Using forensic software designed to peer into the hidden corners of memory, Stone bypassed the visible files and began to excavate the deleted content. There, hidden in the metadata of a discarded Microsoft Word document, he found the digital fingerprints he had been searching for. The software pulled a name from the shadows, Dennis, and beside it, the name of a location, Christ Lutheran Church. The air in the lab seemed to grow still as the words appeared on the screen in cold, white text. It was a trail that led directly away from the darkness of the crime scenes and into the most sacred of community spaces. The investigation turned its gaze toward Christ Lutheran Church, a place of peace and fellowship nestled in the suburban sprawl. The church was a building of warm wood and soft light, where the scent of floor wax and old hymnals hung in the air. But as detectives scrolled through the church's public website, the name Dennis appeared once more. Dennis Rader was the president of the church council, a man known for his dedication to the congregation and his role as a leader of the local Cub Scouts. He was a pillar of the community, a husband and a father who had spent years walking the very streets he had once terrorized. The contrast was staggering. While he was helping to organize church suppers and guiding young boys through the wilderness, he was also the man who had meticulously planned the deaths of 10 innocent people. The investigators began a discreet surveillance, watching as a black Jeep Cherokee, a vehicle previously spotted on grainy security footage near another evidence drop, pulled into the driveway of a modest home on North Independence Avenue. Despite the digital evidence, the police needed a biological lock to secure the case. They turned to a source of DNA that Rader could never have anticipated. They obtained a warrant for a medical sample from his daughter, a pap smear that had been taken at a university clinic years earlier. In the quiet laboratories of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation in Topeka, scientists compared the genetic markers from that sample to the DNA found under the fingernails of Vicki Wedrell, one of the killer's victims from 1986. The match was undeniable. The genetic map of the daughter pointed directly to the father. The 31-year hunt was narrowing down to a single person. On February 25, 2005, the silence of the Wichita streets was broken by the sound of car doors closing and soft, firm voices. Dennis Rader was intercepted while driving home for lunch. The man who had terrorized a city with his elaborate knots and chilling poems was taken into custody without a struggle, his long reign of shadows finally ending under the bright, midday sun of a Kansas afternoon. The winter air in Kansas on that Friday, the 25th of February, 2005, was sharp enough to sting the lungs. It was shortly after noon, and the sun sat high and pale in a vast, empty sky, casting long, thin shadows across the suburb of Park City. Dennis Rader sat behind the wheel of his vehicle, his hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel. To any neighbor glancing through a kitchen window, he was merely the compliance officer, the man who measured the height of their grass with a ruler and scolded them for stray dogs. He was a man of rules, a man of order, returning to a home built on decades of carefully maintained normalcy. But the silence of that drive was about to be shattered by the weight of 30 years of secrets catching up to him in the rearview mirror. When the police cruisers finally pulled him over, there was no dramatic chase, no screeching of tires on the cold asphalt. There was only the rhythmic, clicking sound of turn signals and the heavy, muffled thud of car doors closing in the quiet neighborhood. An officer approached the window, the cold wind whipping at the edges of his uniform. When asked if he knew why he was being taken downtown, Rader did not flinch. He did not protest his innocence with the heat of a wrongly accused man. Instead, he replied with a chilling, measured calmness, saying simply, "Oh, I have suspicions why." It was the answer of a man who had been playing a long game of chess and finally realized he had been placed in checkmate by a floppy disk and a digital footprint he had been too arrogant to hide. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing persistence. Rader sat in a hard chair, his demeanor appearing more like a middle manager at a budget meeting than a man facing the consequences of 10 lives stolen. He spoke for hours, filling 12 digital video discs with a narrative so detached it felt surreal. He referred to his victims as projects, as if they were nothing more than tasks on a to-do list found in a dusty filing cabinet. He described his methods with a terrifying, clinical precision, explaining how he would bind, torture, and kill with the same tone one might use to explain how to fix a leaky faucet or plant a row of corn. There was no tremor in his voice, no moisture in his eyes as he recounted the darkness he called Factor X, the internal shadow that he claimed drove him to hunt. The courtroom in August of 2005 was a place of heavy, suffocating silence. The walls seemed to press inward as the families of the victims sat in the wooden pews, their grief a tangible force in the room. They listened as Judge Gregory Waller began the sentencing, a process that felt like the slow, steady closing of a massive iron door. Because Kansas did not have the death penalty during the years of his primary crimes, the law could only offer time. One by one, the life sentences were announced. One life for the Otero family, another for Catherine Bright, another for Shirley Vian. The numbers climbed until they reached 10 consecutive life terms, a minimum of 175 years. It was a sentence designed to ensure that the only way Dennis Rader would ever leave prison was in a casket, a finality that offered a cold, hard kind of justice to a city that had been looking over its shoulder for 3 decades. Today, the man who called himself BTK lives within the concrete confines of the El Dorado Correctional Facility. His world has shrunk to an 8 by 10-foot cell, a space he has nicknamed El Cavern. The vast Kansas prairies he once prowled are now visible only through the narrowest of margins, if at all. He spends his time reading books like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and playing chess by mail, moving wooden pieces across a board while his own life remains frozen in a permanent stalemate. He writes letters about missing the smell of a charcoal grill and the sight of sunflowers, the very things his victims would never see again. The monster has been reduced to a ledger of dates and a barcode on a prison jumpsuit, a small, aging man kept in the shadows of a high-security wing where the only sound is the echo of heavy doors locking and unlocking in a cycle that will never end. The wind still blows across the plains of Wichita, whispering through the tall grass and the quiet suburban streets. But the fear that once lived in those shadows has been tethered, bound by the very system Rader thought he could outsmart. The houses are locked, the porch lights are on, and the memory of the man behind the door is fading into the archives of history. We can breathe now, knowing the long night has finally come to its conclusion. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.